get my 6. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid, the coolest homesteading channel on the entire internet that has absolutely nothing to do with homesteading. Tonight, as is the case in the month of October, the channel has to do with a really spooky tale, a ghostly tale, demonic tale, and bit of a story behind the story quickly. As a writer, as a storyteller, I can look back and see who inspired me, how I was inspired. My favorite writers are, of course, Stephen King, Mark Twain, Michael Crichton. So they inspired me as a writer, as far as the craft of writing goes. But as far as storytelling itself goes, there was an old man that lived on the mountain above me where I grew up in Appalachia, who was the greatest storyteller I've ever known. His name was PJ, and if you followed the channel for a long time, you've heard me talk about this gentleman before. He's no longer with us. He died maybe 10 years ago. He was in his early 80s when he passed. Decorated Vietnam veteran, a mountain man. He could go out and just look at a tree and tell you what the weather was going to be like for the next 30 days. I mean, that might be a stretch, but he knew the wilderness like no one I ever knew. Great hunter, great tracker, excellent storyteller. There's never been one better. And if he had an old log cabin up on top of the mountain that he used to live in, but he moved off the top of the mountain, a little bit lower down, but still up in the mountain. And he would let me and some of my childhood friends go up there and camp anytime we wanted. And we'd do it a lot in the fall when it was hunting season. We'd go up and use his old cabin as like a hunting camp. And he'd always come up. He'd never spend the night with us, but he'd come up and he'd hang out with us for a couple of hours. And he would tell us the most spine-tingling tales you've ever heard. No two were ever the same, even if he retold one. Never told it the same way. And when he left, we didn't sleep. I mean, that's how good it was, If I had not had my experiences with this man, I probably wouldn't be a writer because I would not have been inspired to tell stories. So that makes this a very special story, the one we're going to read here tonight on October 10. We're going to go back to October Nights Part 1. All of my books, by the way, got to do that shameless self-promotion. October Nights Part 1 and 2, and the other couple dozen of books, novels, short story collections I've written are available on Amazon and print and Kindle, and you can get print copies with autographs on many of them from our Etsy store. The links are in the description box. But now, with no further ado, as my beautiful bride dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, let's get to the story. This one's called The Tale of Old Red Eyes for PJ, the greatest storyteller I ever knew. And remember to watch behind me because you never know who or what may or may not show up during the telling of these tales. We may see old Red Eyes himself. If not today, at least before October's over. Now, boys, this is the last ghost story I'm going to tell you. PJ was old by now by our standards. He was 50. We were 15, and it was our greatest aspirations to achieve his age and his aged wisdom on our own someday. But Christ, how many people actually live for half a century? Well, next month, this guy turns 50. Crazy. Where have the last 35 years between this time and now gone? I have no idea. Because last time I came up and told y'all fellers ghost stories, I was kind of wondering if I was even going to make it home or not. I'm getting too old to outrun the devil or his helpers, so I got to stop this storytelling business if I ain't too late already. PJ had grown up on the mountaintop where we were camping. It was his cabin. It had been his home for many years before he decided a few years before the time in which our story is set to build another one at the foot of the hill about half a mile away. And it was a half mile straight up and down, so it might not have made much sense from just reading this to go through the efforts of building another house only half a mile away, but I'd challenge anyone reading this to try to drive that half mile in the winter. This was West by God, Virginia, and these were the Appalachian mother-loving mountains. And the only reason I'm going to finally tell y'all fellers this story, he continued, is because I feel like I've got to get it off my chest. PJ was a Vietnam veteran. He'd served 20 years in the Navy, and after he retired, he went back to live up in the Hollow, where he'd grown up in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains in West by God, Virginia. Now, the first time I saw him, PJ said, had to have been, 30 years or so ago now. First time you saw who? I asked. Old Red Eyes, he said, as if I were crazy. So the first time I saw him, me and 3 of my best good buddies had been out a-hunting. Turns out it was actually Halloween. So after we was done a-hunting, we decided we'd build us a little campfire right there in the woods where we'd regrouped, and we'd tell us some ghost stories. He had us pulled in already, even though it was just the beginning of his tale. He was good like that. Of course, he said, with a look on his face that said he was remembering something, I was the one ended up telling all the stories. Even in his youth, PJ had been the greatest storyteller for miles around. It's as if he'd been born with the gift. You either have it or you don't, and PJ had it. It's the kind of thing that you just can't get good at, I believe, and I also believe that had PJ ever pursued a career in writing, people today would be saying, who the hell is Stephen King? And for the record, King is my favorite author, so that's meant as a compliment. So boys, did I tell you a good one that night? I mean, it was a whopper. One of the stories that you just make up as you go along, so that's so good. Wait a minute, let me restart this paragraph. So this is PJ sitting around there talking to his friends in his youth, okay? This is the first night he saw old Red Eyes. Now he's speaking to us. So boys, did I tell a good one that night? As he's remembering, telling the stories to his friends. I mean, it was a whopper. One of those stories that you just make up as you go along, and it's so good there's no way you could ever remember it and tell it again. It was one of those, you had to be there to hear it while it was told kind of stories. You mean, I said, it wasn't true? Hell no, PJ said. The best ones never are. Like that one guy said, fiction has to make sense. The true stories don't make no sense, so they're not that good. Of course, that one guy he's referencing would be Mark Twain. Then how do we know that the story you're telling us tonight is true? One of my buddies asked. 'Cause it don't make no sense, PJ said without hesitation, and it ain't that good. It's just what happened, and I'm just trying to get it off my chest. The master was at work. By saying this, he knew exactly what he was doing. It made us want his story even more, true or not. So after I tell these boys this story, PJ continued, we all head off the hill for home. We all lived up this holler, but our houses were all spread out quite a ways, see? I dared to look around the room, and I saw that my buddies were all staring at PJ, wide-eyed, completely enthralled, just as I had been before looking away from him, so I looked back at our speaker. So we all head off the hill in 3 different directions. I get about 100 yards down the hill, and I hear what sounds like footsteps coming up behind me. So I stop, and I look back, and about 50 yards back, I see these 2 red eyes just a-glowing. Why, I ain't seen nothing like that in my life. What was it? One of my buddies asked. We tried to never interrupt PJ when he told us his stories, but man, they were so enthralling, so it made it hard. Why, it was old Red Eyes, PJ said without hesitation. Who was old Red Eyes, I asked. Don't reckon I know, he said, but I think I have an idea, and if you boys will just stop interrupting an old man, I'll get to it. We all mumbled, okay, and he continued. So I looked back only once more that night, because I was too scared to look back more than that, and I didn't even look back that other time until I saw the lights on in the house, and I knew I could make a run for it and I'd be inside just a few seconds, and by God, just like in West by God, Virginia, there were them 2 red eyes just a-glowing in the dark. PJ took a pause before speaking again. We couldn't tell if it was due to him remembering what happened next, or if he was scared just reliving the memory. About 25 years later, he said, when he finally spoke again, which was only a few years back now, my nieces and nephews, which was... Sorry, guys. Forgive the interruption. About 25 years later, he said, when he finally spoke again, which was only a few years back now, my nieces and nephews were up here a-camping, just like y'all fellers are tonight. And I came up and told them some ghost stories. And boys, on that night, I told another whopper. I mean, it was one good enough to be put in a book. Of course, I can't remember to retell it, because I made it up as I was going along. You know the kind. One of those you had to be there to hear to really enjoy it kind of stories. Well, anyway, On the way back down off the hill, because I wasn't camping with him, see, I heard footsteps coming up behind me, just like all those years before. I could tell it wasn't a deer or a bear or a coon. I know the difference between a critter that walks on two legs and one that walks on all fours. So just as y'all fellers would have probably done, I hightailed it to the house and I locked the door behind me. What was it, I asked, though I already knew. Why, it was old Red Eyes, PJ said. So what in the hell is this old Red Eyes thing, one of my buddies asked. Well, if you let an old man finish his story, you'll know, PJ said. And we let him. So when I was up here last night, telling y'all fellers stories, PJ began, that Bigfoot Sasquatch story you told us was awesome, one of my buddies said, and we all elbowed him for interrupting. Yeah, PJ said, giggling, that was a good one, what a whopper. Anyway, he continued, when I went home last night after telling y'all fellers those stories, I kid you not, guess who followed me home? Old Red Eyes, my three friends and I said in unison. That's right, PJ said, old Red Eyes. What'd you do, I asked. Ran like hell, PJ said, and it was hard going. I'm pert near half a century old. I'm too old to be out running demons, and that's exactly what I think old Red Eyes is, a demon, and that's why I can't tell y'all fellers any more of these here stories. What's it want, I asked, this demon? Pert near as far as I can figure, PJ said, which is Appalachian American for the best thing I can guess, is old Red Eyes just loves a good story well told. And that was it. No further explanation. You're kidding, one of my buddies said. He was the analytical type, the one to whom everything had to make sense. He went on to be an accountant for the government. And that's what I was trying to tell y'all fellers earlier, PJ said. The best stories ain't true because they make sense, like that famed Twain feller said. The real life stories, they ain't as good because they don't make no sense. I would end up losing touch with PJ for many, many years. I grew up and I left that little mountain town. I got a college education and moved to a city and became a stockbroker. Years later, when the Twin Towers fell, I joined the military and got to see the beautiful landscapes and war zones of Iraq behind the sights of a .50 caliber machine gun after having gone down and enlisted in the Army National Guard to get my payback. One night, while driving across the Arabian Desert, near the end of our deployment, during which I'd seen shit that I wish wasn't real, and it definitely made no sense, just like PJ and that Twain guy said, I made myself a promise. I promised myself that if I made it home alive and not in a pine box, that I was no longer going to do the things that I didn't enjoy doing, like being a stockbroker, and that I was only going to do the things that I enjoyed doing. What I enjoyed most was telling stories. I pert near decided that night while riding across the desert, hoping not to get my ass shot off, that I was going to go home and become a writer. And I, by God, did, just like the by God in West Virginia. I went back and visited my old friend PJ for the first time in 20 years after making it home from the war. I missed him, I missed his stories, but as a combat veteran now myself, I think I understood some things about him that I hadn't before. His desire to live alone with his family on a mountaintop and be left the ever-loving hell alone by the rest of the world. It's people filled with their opinions, all based on shit they saw on TV, like the news, and from shit they heard from other people, or even things they read in a book, but not based on any actual experience. Hell, it took me no time at all to find out that if I talked about what was really going on in Iraq and what I saw, I could get my accounts canceled on social media, and everyone would call me a liar due to that, quote, my grandfather was a veteran and he never talked about it, so if you're talking about it, you're lying and you're probably not even a veteran, end quote, bullshit. Veterans envy, I've come to call it, because it always comes from beta males who never served and who feel like less of a man in the presence of anyone who has served. But I stopped talking about it pert quick, nonetheless, as PJ might have said. But I talked about it with PJ, and he helped me. He helped me immensely. He helped me so much more than those social workers they call counselors at the VA and all those goddamn pills they gave me every time I went. At one point, I had 8 different prescriptions, and son of a bitch if I could even tell you my birth date when I was on them all. But PJ told me stories. He told me stories of his war experiences. He told me what worked for him as far as coping goes, and he told me that he thought the promise I'd made to myself that night in the Arabian desert would be the best promise I could make to myself, and it would be a great thing if I kept it. And I have. I wrote a novel very tightly based on my years growing up on PJ's Mountain. It's a novel called From the Graves of Babes, and you can get it on Amazon just like you did this collection of stories you're reading now. If you got it on Amazon. PJ was one of the main characters in that story. Well, one of the main characters in that story were tightly based on PJ, even the character's name. And it was one of my greatest honors to this day that PJ got to read that book before he died, an accomplished old man and a hero just a couple of years later. The last time I saw PJ, I asked him if he remembered the tale of Old Red Eyes. He said he did. I asked him if it was true or not, and he said, "Yeah, I read that book you wrote, the one with me in it." "Yeah," I said. "You be careful with your storytelling going forward," he said, and he said it like a warning. "Why?" I asked. "You're getting pretty good at it," he said, pausing. "Your storytelling." After appearing to think for a moment, he said, "I fear you're going to end up getting the answer to your own question if you keep at it." The end. So PJ's belief that Old Red Eyes is a demon, a shadow person perhaps we've heard many people talk about, who simply hankers for a good story well told. I hope you feel that that was one of them. And I hope you'll join me again tomorrow night for another one. Until then, see ya back here, the greatest homesteading channel on the internet that has nothing to do with homesteading. Homesteading off the grid.